This is a history of the Winnipeg General Strike. However, I think to really understand the significance of this, really historic strike, we also have to understand the history that came before it and that led up to it. And so I'm actually going to be spending some time at the beginning of this presentation outlining the early history of the Canadian working class, ultimately explaining how it contributed to the Winnipeg General Strike. So the first point I want to make is that throughout this early history, there are two clear tendencies in the labor movement that emerge from this very early stage. On the one hand, there is the fighting, militant, and even revolutionary tradition that is really most clearly associated with the Winnipeg strike itself, as well as several other important strikes such as Oshawa GM, Ford Windsor in 1945, and the Quebec Common Front strike in 1972. On the other hand, there is another tendency which has come to be known as the respectable or conservative business unionist tendency. And this really only became predominant in Canada in the post-war period and still has lingering influence to this day. Now, I'm not really going to talk about business unionism today, but I think it's useful to just, understand this idea of the two tendencies in the labor movement as sort of the backdrop for this presentation. And I would say the fighting tradition really represents more than anything the unconscious desire of the working class to change society. And I think I would argue that this tendency is present in the class from its very birth and reaches fruition with some of its earliest mass struggles, such as Winnipeg 1919. And why do I say from birth? Well, it's not because I think that workers are some kind of, divinely ordained creature, sent down from the heavens above to, spread enlightenment to the masses. I've worked with many blue-collar workers in my own history, and, I know that these workers are capable of simultaneously holding very advanced ideas with some of the most backwards, prejudicial ideas. And so, this is a contradiction that I think is real. But I think we also have to try to look at history objectively as it connects to the struggle of the workers. And I think on this point, workers are a product of society. And under the present society, this means that workers are entirely dependent for their livelihoods on the bosses. And in other words, they are dependent on wage labor. And this, of course, is no benevolent relationship. The bosses, after all, are out there to make profits, and it is only on the backs of the workers' labor that they are able to do so. By exploiting the workers in this way, the bosses whet their appetite for what Karl Marx referred to as surplus value. But, the question then becomes, how much profit, how much surplus value is enough for these people? The answer is there is no theoretical maximum. Jeff Bezos, already one of the richest people in the world before the pandemic, made an additional $74 billion between March and September of 2020. At the same time that his Amazon workers who are making these profits for him were working and were dying by contracting COVID-19. In the early period of development of capitalism in Britain, I can give another example. In Britain in the early 19th century, children as young as 6 to 8 years old were routinely employed in the factories, sometimes for upwards of 16 to 20 hours per day, 6 days a week. The average lifespan of these workers at this time was between 20 and 30 years of age. Eventually, the British government actually had to step in to limit the number of working hours children and grown people could work in these factories, as this was really affecting the ability of these workers to raise families and produce the next generation of workers for the bosses to exploit. So in a sense, the government really had to save the capitalists from themselves to ensure the stability of its own system. And I hope you can understand as a result of this that when I say that the tendency of workers to fight and to struggle to transform society is the natural or original tendency of our class, this is why. It is born of the high degree of exploitation and oppression that workers suffer on a day-to-day basis, and which they eventually realize there is no other way to respond other than to fight and to organize. Now, this fight, I would say, or this desire is unconscious at first, because in the initial stage, lacking any form of education or organization to help channel and focus their anger, workers tend to lash out at whatever is in front of them. So, for example, in the initial stage in Britain, they would just destroy the machines that they were, that they had to work on every day. Eventually, of course, they realized that the machine is not the source of their ills, but of course, the boss that owns the machines. And from that point forward, class struggle historically becomes conscious, and history really begins in earnest. So how does this all actually play out in Canadian history? Well, to give a brief history of some of the earliest episodes of class struggle in Canada, you could say the first workers in this country were the voyageurs and the canoemen who worked for the Hudson's Bay and the Northwest trading companies, regularly engaging in backbreaking portages through the woods and lakes with tons of merchandise strapped to their canoes. The average lifespan of these workers was about 30 years of age. The first recorded strike in history was started when these workers in 1794 withdrew their labor for higher wages. And this action resulted in all of them losing their jobs and the strike being broken. Now, waves of Irish immigrants were brought in over the 1840s to work on the great canal building projects in Ontario, connecting the St. Lawrence River with lakes further inland, and enabling the further development of Canadian capitalism in the process. While this was low-wage, industrial, unskilled labor, these immigrants did not really actually view themselves as workers at this time, but rather saw this work as simply a means to an end of buying their own plot of land in order to become independent, prosperous farmers. Reality, in most cases, though, proved otherwise. The wages provided just enough for these unskilled workers to get by in the good times. But when crises of overproduction arose, such as they did in 1825, 1833, 1845, and so on, these layers were often ruined economically in the process. Skilled workers managed to organize themselves eventually into craft unions in this early period, but even these could only eke out a precarious existence. They were tolerated by the bosses and states so long as they did not actually go on strike. And operated as mere mutual aid societies, pooling their own resources for insurance plans and welfare benefits, but they were of course crushed as soon as they began to go on strike and withdraw their labor. Outstanding examples of this included that involving the master printer William Lyon Mackenzie, who, despite leading the Upper Canada Rebellion a year later, in 1836, actually fired his own journeyman printers for going on strike for a 10-hour day. George Brown, owner of what would later become today's Globe and Mail, a major newspaper, outdid him, Mackenzie, by breaking his journeyman's attempt to strike and form a union twice in the 1840s. These craft workers, I think, despite this, very ferocious repression, were ultimately done in by their own narrow outlook at this time. And really their naivete. They actively opposed organizing unskilled workers, women, and sometimes even their own journeymen in their own trade, and preferred to view themselves and their masters together as a part of the same time-honored and insular craft that they were a part of. George Brown, on the other hand, while this was going on, was actively hiring women and apprentices at lower wages in order to do the work of these more skilled workers. And of course, George Brown was doing this to raise his profits and further divide his workers in the process. Brown, in this case, you could say, possessed a clear class consciousness and awareness of what he wanted and how to get it, whereas his workers, unfortunately, did not at this stage. Now, in spite of all this, there was a great upsurge of militancy in the movement from the 1880s onwards. In the 1870s, craft unions had fought for the 9-hour day, for political representation in Parliament, and briefly actually created a national union federation, the Canadian Labour Union, before this was all wiped out by a world economic slump in 1873. This slump, however, gave way to a greater wave of industrial capitalist development, particularly through the government-financed construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. New industrial workers, including women, immigrants, and black workers, were organized by the Knights of Labor, a new union which spread like wildfire across the entire continent because of its progressive views towards these unskilled workers. Its fatal flaw was that it possessed a sort of idealist vision of peaceful cooperative production and was actually actively opposed to strikes. This played out most starkly in the 1886 Toronto Street Railway strike. It was actually a lockout, where the workers tried to organize a rival cooperative in the middle of the struggle and were crushed again as a result. The Knights of Labor consequently disappeared just as quickly as they had sprung up, and were really a spent force by the end of the 1880s. Their main legacies were the imprint they laid down for industrial unionism, that is, to organize all workers regardless of skill level, race, gender, or immigrant status in the mass production industries, as well as local labor councils that the Knights organized in Hamilton, Montreal, Ottawa, and other places that did manage to achieve a more durable existence going forward. Now, to be honest, the history that I've covered to this point has almost exclusively been a history of Ontario and Quebec. There is a reason for this, however, as this is where Canadian capitalism really developed first. With the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the country finally began to integrate itself economically from coast to coast, although primarily to the benefit of Ontario and Quebec. The role for the so-called hinterland regions in the east and the west and the north within this new confederation was to supply the center with raw materials, including timber, minerals, and food. Of these minerals, coal was by far the most important to stoking the fires of industrial development. And perhaps not so coincidentally at this time, major deposits were discovered on the Vancouver Island and in Nova Scotia in Cape Breton. The coal miners got organized from an early stage on the East Coast, forming the Provincial Workmen's Association in 1879. And despite the vicious reaction of the bosses to its mere existence, managed to keep this organization together. Miners on the West Coast were not so lucky, however, facing powerful local oligarchs such as the Dunsmuirs, who linked up with American capital and local militias, were able to prevent the formation of really any unions there for almost 40 years. Eventually, however, in 1895, the Western Federation of Miners was formed. And due to the extreme conditions under which it operated, it adopted a quite radical outlook, embracing socialism officially at its 1902 Congress. The burgeoning militant tendency in the workers' movement in this regard was not just limited to the West. The failure of the 1886 Toronto Street Railway strike gave way to a series of rail strikes on a higher level in the 1890s and 1900s in Ontario, beginning in London in 1898, followed by Toronto in 1902, and then Hamilton and Winnipeg in 1906. The pattern was quite similar in each case. In London, facing a ruthless private utility empire, the militant workers attacked scabs and company vehicles in the streets with the acts of support of the local population in solidarity. A year later, after a victory from this initial struggle, the company reneged on their commitments, and a bitter months-long struggle ensued, leading to the Riot Act being read and the militia being called in to crush the strike. The Toronto and Hamilton workers subsequently managed to beat back these scabs and militias by mobilizing public sympathy even more extensively, proving once again that workers do learn from their experience and their previous failures. Now, despite these defeats and some victories, the strike wave continued to crescendo in the period leading up to World War I. From 1901 to 1905, for example, 2.5 million hours of labor were lost due to strikes. And this shot up to 3.3 million from 1906 to 1910, and then to 5 million hours from 1911 to 1915. In this burgeoning area of monopoly capitalism, the weapons of the bosses were formidable. Among them were layoffs, blacklists, spies, detectives, private police, and scabs, which were all used quite routinely. And that does not to even mention the role of the state. The paramilitary state organ, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, along with militias in local centers, were routinely used to send in and crush strikes. For example, with Gatling guns, machine guns, in the 1906 Winnipeg rail strike, and fixed bayonets in the 1909 Cape Breton coal strike. the list of martyrs from this, really extreme class prejudice, grew and grew over these years, and included fellows such as Frank Rogers, who was killed in the 1903 Brotherhood of Rail Employees strike, Robert Kirk, shot by a strikebreaker in the 1908 CPR shopman strike, and the DePrenzo brothers shot 12 times by the police in the coal handlers strike at Port Arthur. Well, this was generally a period of economic boom. The fact that the workers did not share in this prosperity was a major underlying cause of this growing strike wave and unionization wave. Violent repression merely served to spur the movement on to new heights. Now, in the history of worker struggle, I would say there's another very general tendency, which is that the working class, once it moves into action on the economic front, primarily through strike action, and has their hopes frustrated there, will frequently move to the political front and look to political parties to elect them to power, or where they do not exist, they will move to create their own political parties in their place. Now, the early stages of political action throughout, the 19th century were mostly fruitless. Craft leaders hitched a wagon often to either the liberals or conservatives, sometimes around their own candidates who would often just, sell out and join the liberals or conservatives within a year or two. But a breakthrough did finally occur in the second half of the 1900s. So, frustrated by the lack of success of the strike wave of the 1890s and the first half of the 1900s, and, really radicalized by the brutality of the bosses in the state, workers did turn to the political front, and they created the Socialist Party of Canada in 1905. Now, this was based in Vancouver originally, but this was not just a group of, middle-class intellectuals, as, some would think that, socialists are. But actually, this party was organically connected to the working class from the very beginning, and quickly spread to other cities in Winnipeg, Montreal, and Toronto within a short period of time. Now, despite their initial success, this party, the Socialist Party of Canada, was quite confused politically and lacked a really centralized organization. It took inspiration from, left-wing reformists such as Keir Hardie and Eugene Debs in Britain and the U.S. On the one hand, as well as genuine revolutionaries like Karl Marx and Daniel De Leon. In the end, a split in such an organization with a lack of political clarity was really inevitable, and the right wing took the initiative in 1911, forming the Social Democratic Party of Canada under the leadership of James Simpson. The two parties achieved roughly equal strength at their height, with about 3,000 members each. But whereas the Socialist Party was mainly based in Western Canada, the SDP was primarily based here in Ontario. So the outbreak of the war cut across the class struggle for a time. Blatant profiteering of the bosses during the war, however, combined with high inflation, which outpaced wage growth, all of this soon brought the simmering contradictions to a boiling point. And this is perhaps a useful point to mention the role of the Trades and Labor Congress, or TLC, which is the equivalent of today's Canadian Labor Congress. And although, this body was much smaller than the CLC today and almost exclusively craft-based and actively opposed to industrial unionism and striking for most of its history. It was originally founded in 1886, and it split in 1902, but nominally moved to the left when a guy named James Waters, who was supposedly a socialist, was elected as its president in 1910. Now, Waters initially pledged to oppose the war, but he quickly backtracked on this claim when the war broke out. Later on in the war, he even buckled on the promise to oppose conscription in the war, which was carried out. All of this spinelessness really served to drive a large wedge in between the TLC leadership, much of whose was based in Ontario, and the left-wing militants and socialists based in the West. The BC Federation, which was the newspaper of the Vancouver Labour Council and the BC Federation of Labour, led as it was by Socialist Party activists at the time, proclaimed angrily in response, and I'll quote, "There is nothing in common between the labor movement in the East and that of the West. The labor movement of the East is reactionary and servile to the core. If there has been any advance in progressive thought, it has come as a rule from the West." Now, the struggle against conscription took place through the course of 1917, and was particularly intense in Quebec, where MP and former plumber Alphonse Verville proclaimed that, quote, "The French Canadians are prepared for civil war." Trade union membership reached a new high of 200,000 members this year, and of those, 50,000 went on strike. This was again eclipsed the very next year, 1918, by an increase to 250,000 union members, 80,000 of which went on strike as the anti-conscription movement deepened. Now, this tactic of the sympathy or solidarity strike was developed in Winnipeg in April 19 over city workers attempting to gain the legal right to strike, and again in July when it was the postal workers' turn to do the same. Public and private sector workers united to shut down the city's water supply, electricity, telephone, and transportation services, leading city council to panic and to concede on this key demand. This really showed that militancy could win and inspired other groups to follow in their example from this point forward. Now, around the same time, the ugly face of reaction showed itself most clearly when Ginger Goodwin, a leader in the BC labor movement, was really just assassinated in cold blood by Vancouver police, leading the Vancouver Labour Council to declare a 24-hour general strike in protest. Now, with these latest developments, I think you could say the stage was set for Winnipeg, for a decisive confrontation between workers and the bosses. Amidst the underlying conditions of high unemployment and high inflation, the increasing radicalization of workers and soldiers returned home from the war, and the ruthless determination of the bosses to not give an inch to any of the demands of the workers, including union recognition or wage increases, there could be really no other resolution in this situation other than class war. The bosses had been waging this war really the entire time, but now the masses were ready to increasingly fight back with a strength that they had never before known that they possessed. In 1919, for example, union membership rose to 380,000, a 50% increase in just 1 year, and 150,000 of these workers went on strike, a number which would not be surpassed until almost 25 years later in 1943. This crucial question, the crucial question of broader unity within the labor movement, though, was still unresolved. The Western militants were basically on the front lines of the struggle consistently and were practically putting themselves as the effective leaders of the movement of the entire country, demonstrating in practice the superiority of their ideas and methods. But the formal leadership of the TLC remained in the hands of the conservatives out east, and therefore something had to give. At a TLC conference in Quebec in October 1918, almost all of the Western delegates' motions and candidates were defeated by Eastern delegates, who were able to outmobilize them due to the vast distances and costs that were involved with the Westerners traveling out east. The Western delegates then, quite disappointed and angry, went back home and decided to call a conference of their own in Calgary in March 1919. The proposed program for this convention was industrial unionism and a 30-hour work week, quite an inspiring slogan. And it had a general resolution that I'll actually read in full because I think it's quite illuminating. So, quote, "Realizing that the aims and objects of the labor movement should be the improving of the social and economic conditions of society and the workers in particular, and whereas the present system of production for profit and the institutions resulting therefrom prevent this from being achieved, be it therefore resolved that the aims of labor as represented by this convention are the abolition of the present system of production for profit and the substitution of this by production for use." So first-hand accounts of the convention of 250 delegates, which represented many more thousands of workers all across the country in the West, report that this resolution was carried, quote, "without a dissenting voice amid prolonged cheers." The convention demanded the government grant a 30-hour week, repeal repressive wartime legislation, and release political prisoners. It set a deadline of June 1st for the state to deliver on these demands or else face a general strike. Now, this of course was all very impressive, but I think you could say that the Western labor leaders maybe got a little too carried away when in the midst of such a convention, they proposed the creation of a brand new union, the One Big Union, as they called it, which was effectively a split away from the TLC. Well, such a giant industrial union embracing, radical ideas contained within it a huge potential. To isolate itself at the same time from the workers of the East was really just an act of self-sabotage. Had these militant leaders possessed the patience to organize to win the leadership of the TLC just a year later, they could have mobilized workers from coast to coast in the fight for union rights and living wages. Now, instead, they put the bosses in the federal government in a position where it could concentrate its forces of repression on just the radical West. In the end, the decisive confrontation in Winnipeg really broke out before any of this could happen, before the Westerners had a chance to carry out this or any other task, really. They didn't even have time to start organizing the One Big Union before the Winnipeg strike broke out. But I think this point still stands as an important lesson for us today. Broad unity on the basis of fighting ideas is paramount in the struggle against the bosses. Without it, ultimately, we can only get so far. Now, the immediate spark for the Winnipeg general strike was provided when the building trades workers walked out in early May over the refusal of their right to collectively bargain with their employer. The various building trades unions had joined together into a broader council to bargain previously and were demanding a living wage, that is, a wage to keep up with inflation. In the previous 5 years, the strikers pointed out, wages had only risen 18%, whereas inflation had risen by 80%. The workers are demanding, as a result, a 32% wage increase, whereas the bosses were only offering 15%. And moreover, only made these offers to individual unions separately rather than negotiate with the council together as a whole. As a result, these workers hit the picket lines on May 1st, on May Day, the International Day of the Worker, and called for the entire Winnipeg working class to join them in solidarity. The metal trades workers embarked on their own strike just a day later over fundamentally the same issue of union recognition. These two industry councils brought their plea for solidarity to the Winnipeg Labour Council on May 6th, which endorsed their demands, and not only this, actually called for a ballot of all affiliated unions to democratically decide on whether to join a general strike or not. Once the ballots were counted on May 13th, the results were as follows: 8,667 workers in favor and only 645 opposed. And this was with over a 75% participation rate of the affiliated workers to the council. And on May 15th, as a result, the entire city of Winnipeg was ground to a complete halt. As they often do, it was the women workers that got the strike started. At 7 a.m. that morning, 500 workers at the telephone exchange walked out of their shifts in the middle of their shift, and thus it was started. Now, far surpassing the mere 12,000 affiliated workers of the Winnipeg Labour Council, in the end, on that day and in the ensuing days, anywhere between 24 and 30,000 workers joined the strike, which together really represented the vast majority of the working population of Winnipeg, including both union and non-union workers, very importantly. The general strike was in fact so popular that in fact the entire police force offered to join the strike in solidarity, as did the returned soldiers from the war, who voted unanimously at a meeting of their veterans associations to express their full sympathy. The 95 participating unions in the strike elected a strike committee of 300 with 3 reps from each union. And in turn, this committee elected an executive committee of 15. The committee then made the decision to start up a daily strike bulletin to inform on the progress of the strike and to help counter the propaganda and the lies of the bosses through their own media. To give you a taste of really what this quite delightful reporting from the mainstream media looked at the time, I'll actually read a quote from the Winnipeg Citizen. Quote, "In their fight, the citizens of Winnipeg have contended against great odds. when through the machinations of a number of confessed Bolshevists in the Winnipeg Labor Temple, between 20 and 30,000 were tricked and betrayed into striking. The issue went right to the heart of the great body of middle-class citizens whom the strike leaders sought to deprive of the very necessities of life, of food and water, of light, police protection, and fire protection. So contrary to these, obvious lies, while the city was shut down, essential services such as bread and milk delivery were maintained. The only condition was that these delivery trucks had to maintain a sign saying permitted by authority of the strike committee to make sure that, make clear that they were not scabbing on the strike. In the words of the strike committee, quote, "Not a wheel was turning in the big plants, not a streetcar was visible, and on the face of every worker was the cheerful, optimistic smile of confidence in the justice of their cause." Now, the reality of the situation was that the leaders of the strike, despite the claims of the Winnipeg citizen, were not Bolsheviks, actually. Contrary to the claims, only one of the 15 members of the executive, for example, R.B. Russell, was a member of the more radical One Big Union that was dedicated to abolishing capitalism. To counter the claims of inciting violent revolution that were peddled by the press, the strike committee really bent over backwards to prove that this was not actually their aim, instructing the police, for example, to remain on duty rather than join the strike, and restraining the workers from actively picketing. Instead, they instructed them to, quote, "do nothing, just eat, sleep, play, love, laugh, and look at the sun." Unfortunately, the science of looking directly into the sun must not have been well established at this point in history. This robbed the strike of one of its most important sources of strength. Aside from shutting production down, maintaining picket lines also, of course, allows the workers to get a taste of their own strength, to maintain their morale, and to really remain in solidarity with one another, the longer the strike goes on. And, I think you could say that, the strike leaders were certainly courageous and honest individuals. They were not trying to betray the strike, of course not. But they did lack a real understanding of what was at stake in this situation. On the surface level, yes, the strike was about union recognition and the fight for a living wage. But to fight for it with the method of the unlimited general strike inevitably raises the question of power. And once this question is raised, you either have to answer it or it will be answered for you by those that will stop at nothing to crush you for merely raising the question. In the words of the historian Ian Angus, quote, "Whether they knew it or not, the strikers had radically undermined the ability of the ruling class to rule. The basic day-to-day decisions about the functioning of society were being made, at least in part, by the strikers and their leaders. As the bosses believed it to be their divine right to run society on their own dictatorial terms, so any challenge to this right, according to them, had to be put down with extreme prejudice." Now, once the strike was on, the forces of reaction wasted no time in mobilizing all of their resources to do just this. They created what they called the Citizens Committee of 1,000, headed up by the Winnipeg Board of Trade, the Manufacturers Association, the Winnipeg Bar, along with other wealthy individuals and students. The committee worked day and night to undermine the strike by any means necessary, such as arranging scab labor, orchestrating a Red Scare, to paint the strike leaders as bloodthirsty Bolsheviks. Contrary to the claim that the strikers were conspiring to overthrow the government, it was the Citizens Committee that actually began conspiring with the federal government to drown the movement in blood at an early stage. When Minister of the Interior Arthur Mahan arrived in Winnipeg from Ottawa about a week into the strike, for example, rather than meet with the strikers or the elected representatives of local or provincial government first, he instead met secretly with representatives of the Citizens Committee. This unelected body not only clearly had friends in high places, but was prepared to use this to stamp out any attempts to compromise. For example, when the Iron Masters indicated that they were prepared to recognize the Steelworkers Council's right to bargain, the Citizens Committee swooped in to whip them back into line and to remove the offer. This is a clear example of the class unity and the militancy of the rich and powerful that they enforced within their own ranks, to which the strikers could only respond with a militant, more democratic unity on an even higher level. These reactionaries derided the strike leaders as enemy aliens, all the while attempting to use immigrant workers as scabs to divide the movement. To counter these efforts, the Daily Strike Bulletin published the following account on May 27th. Quote, "At the time, the Committee of 1000 were agitating the public mind against the, quote, alien with demands for his deportation. At the same time, they were touring the alien district in limousine and taxi, begging, pleading, imploring, and bribing the female alien species to come to their aid and replace the female workers who were on strike. But the alien declined their tempting offers and stuck tight as a postage stamp. For the workers of Winnipeg, the barriers of color, race, and creed had been torn down and are now beyond hope of being rebuilt, as it should be. To break this deep bond between the workers, which included the active solidarity of the returned workers and police, the forces of reaction needed a battering ram more fitted to their liking. They dismissed the entire police force in early June and replaced them with an armed militia of goons specially selected from their own ranks. These reactionaries, combined with the paramilitary Royal Northwest Mounted Police, soon to be renamed the RCMP, as we all know today, would both be used in tandem to attempt to deliver the fatal blow. Now, to support their plans, the federal government on June 6 passed a new piece of legislation. This bill was put through three readings through 2 houses of parliament and given the Governor General's assent and a grand total of, what do you think? 1 week, 2 days, 1 day?
1 day.
45 minutes. Surely a world record at the time. This law, of course, was not to recognize the right to collective bargaining, but to be able to deport naturalized citizens without trial who were suspected of sedition. 12 days later, it was put into practice. 6 of the key strike leaders, including R.B. Russell, were arrested, along with 5 other workers. Included among them was a Russian youth, of whose home, according to the account of the strike committee, quote, "The minions of the law did not trouble to knock, but found the way to his bedroom in the dark by means of a flashlight, threw back the bedclothes, grabbed him by the feet, and flashing the flashlight in his eyes whilst the 2 redcoats pointed their guns at his head, gave him 5 minutes to get dressed. His name was not on the warrant, and in fact no warrant was issued for him until he had been in the penitentiary for 36 hours. So just an idea of, the extreme prejudice, for daring to raise their head. In response to this, a general strike was called in New Westminster, BC, in protest, joining Vancouver workers who had already been out for 2 weeks. In total, general strikes of varying duration and extent took place in 13 cities across the country, including in Toronto and Calgary. Poor coordination between them, however, meant that not everybody was out at the same time and for the same duration to really bring the government to its knees. In addition to this, the Winnipeg Strike Committee simply failed to prepare for the inevitable clash with the authorities to enact any measures of self-defense or security, and also neglected to meaningfully involve rank-and-file workers in the decision-making process, really throughout the entire duration of the strike. Pressure and feedback from the ranks might have pushed the leadership to take the more necessary bold steps to extend and defend the strike to give it a real chance of winning, but alas, this was not the case. Now, despite the enforced passivity of the workers during the strike, soldiers had been routinely organizing mass meetings, demonstrations, and parades throughout. When on June 21st they organized their latest action, a silent parade, 50 RNWMP policemen on horses charged on the crowd firing pistols loaded with live ammunition. One of these bullets hit striker Mike Sokolowski right in the heart, killing him instantly. Dozens of others were injured on that day, and days later, another striker, Steve Skezerbanovich, succumbed to his wounds. On June 26, the strike committee called off the strike and without having achieved any of their aims. The Winnipeg General Strike was thus bitterly defeated. Emboldened by their victory, the bosses went on an all-out offensive in the ensuing years, rolling back wages and breaking unions in the process. It would really take another 25 years of struggle before the right to collectively bargaining was finally won after the Ford-Windsor strike in 1945. But even then, it was only granted to the private sector. Public sector workers would have to wage another determined struggle in the 60s and 70s to win this right for themselves. Now, in hindsight, one might ask, should the Winnipeg workers have fought at all? Given the conditions at the time, I would argue, and I made the case here, that there was really no other alternative. The fight was already being brought to them on a daily basis in the form of unemployment and runaway inflation, making their lives increasingly unbearable in the process. The better question to ask is, what methods of fighting would have given them the best chances of winning in these conditions? And I think from the beginning, to look at the situation as a whole now, the strikers had a number of things working in their favor. So past experience had taught them that of the need not to face off with the employer separately in their isolated craft unions, but together in an industry-wide council of unions fighting and negotiating together simultaneously. Recent struggle had also proved that even this alone was not necessarily sufficient, though. In March 1919, as a result, the two councils went to the Winnipeg Labour Council asking for broader solidarity. And the fact that the call was taken up, nearly unanimously by almost the entire Winnipeg working class showed that, all workers felt that this was their cause as well, and if they won, it would all come to them in turn eventually. The broad and extensive support the strike enjoyed at the outset was really part of a broader sentiment which extended across the entire country. This support included, as mentioned, that of the returned soldiers and the local police force, which were layers that were normally mobilized by the state to crush strikes. And this temporarily paralyzed the ability of the state to assert itself in the early stages of the strike. Now, with this said, the strike leadership, were much too eager to prove to the ruling class that they were not Bolsheviks, that they were not revolutionaries aiming to, violently overthrow the government. In order to prove that they were committed to law and order, for example, as I mentioned, they voluntarily held back the workers from playing an active role over the course of the strike. And this really killed a lot of the momentum of the strike in the process. The leaders also failed to actively coordinate the extension of the strike to other cities across the country. Shutting down the entire country would have put the maximum amount of pressure on the government and on the bosses to concede. This, of course, is a very difficult thing to pull off in practice, granted, especially given the lack of unity between the leaderships in the east and in the west of the country at the time. But nevertheless, the willingness to fight was present amongst broad layers of the population from coast to coast, and so this should really be noted as a part of this history. The most important lesson of the failure of the Winnipeg General Strike was about the need for a mass political party of the workers to really be able to provide the most complete answer to the question of power that was raised by the General Strike. As mentioned earlier, the Socialist and Social Democratic parties were the closest things to this at the time, but they were really not mass parties with only like 3,000 members each. The radical wing of labor leaders afterwards went on to form the Communist Party of Canada in 1921. And this party, I believe, did really have a chance to become the first mass labor party of the workers in Canada. But unfortunately, the Communist Party squandered this opportunity through a series of serious mistakes made after 1924. Eventually, the baton was passed to what we know as the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, or the CCF, under the leadership of J.S. Woodsworth and Tommy Douglas. And this became the first mass workers' party ever to come to power in a province when it did so in Saskatchewan in 1944. Now, there are many more lessons, I think, when it comes to this question of how the workers can ever meaningfully take power away from the bosses. not just in one province, but really across the country and even across the world. This discussion, or that discussion, I really, is not immediately relevant to this campaign, but, I'd be happy to chat about it in the pub afterwards if anybody would like. For now, I think I'll bring my presentation to a close. And in the discussion, I'd like to hear from all of you as to, how you feel the lessons of this strike can be applied to our struggle today in the fight with this campaign.